Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. It's great to see lots of people able to make it. My name's Lorraine Whitmarsh. I am a Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Bath, and I'm Director of CAST, which is the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And this morning's webinar is brought to you by CAST. It showcased some of the work that we've been doing. The webinar is being recorded, so we'll be able to share that recording with you afterwards. And if you would like to ask, and we would very much welcome you asking questions and making comments, please do that using the Q&A function at the bottom. There is also a chat function if you don't have access to the Q&A, but ideally pose questions to the speakers in the Q&A, please. So I'm just going to kick off by saying a little bit about what our centre is before I pass on to our other speakers. So the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations started about 3.5 years ago. We're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and our head office is at the University of Bath. But you can see that we're a consortium of several universities, Bath being one, Cardiff, Manchester, UEA, York, and the charity Climate Outreach. And all those smaller logos at the bottom are a small selection of the various partners that we are working with, because we want to really try and be very much about doing applied action-based research. So we're working in partnership with lots of different organisations. And this is the structure of the centre. We have 4 themes. So we do work looking at visioning what a low carbon future could and should look like. So that involves deliberative work, some scenarios and modelling, tracking public perceptions using longitudinal surveys, etc. Learning, so we've been doing systematic reviews to try to understand how transformation has occurred in the past and how it is occurring currently in lots of different places, and how government-led transformations occur, as well as bottom-up, more societal-led transformation. A big part of what we do is number 3, trialling, and that's probably the majority of what you'll hear about today, which is really looking across different scales to see how we can test out new ways of living and new ways of doing things which are aligned with net zero. And then engagement is our 4th theme, which is really about embedding transformation across society through a number of different mechanisms. So really a sort of key question that we're asking in CAST is, how can we as a society live differently and better to achieve systemic, deep and rapid emission reductions? So we're interested in climate change mitigation, in reducing emissions. And we're interested in the people bit of that, essentially. So we see people as agents of change, and change across different scales. So from the individual through community, organisation, city, region, and national and international level. And engagement with people is key at all of those different levels. And you'll get a sense of those different levels in some of the talks that we'll be giving today. We look across different areas of activity: food, heating and cooling, material consumption, and mobility. And mobility is the one that we'll be focusing on today. And the reason why transport and mobility is so important is because it's the highest emitting sector. So it represents about 1/4 of UK greenhouse gas emissions. It is the one where we've seen probably least progress in terms of decarbonisation. In fact, emissions rose more than other sectors up until 2021. And it's also the area where there is, or it's one of the many areas where behaviour change can make a really big difference. So in actual fact, if you look at the top things that individuals can do to reduce their carbon footprint, then transport behaviours account for the top ones there, actually. So giving up your car or switching to electric vehicles, etc., are very effective things you can do to reduce your carbon emissions. So within CAST, we're doing lots of work on transport and mobility. For example, we're working with Ipsos Mori to understand public support for net zero policies, including various transport policies like frequent flyer levies and electric vehicle subsidies. So we found, and we recently published, evidence to show that there is strong support for those sorts of policies. We're working with the charity Possible to evaluate their climate perk scheme. This is a scheme working with employers that rewards employees for reducing flying for going on holiday by giving them extra days annual leave. You'll also hear shortly about a project we're doing with Possible to explore car-free cities. We've been looking at COVID-19 as a potential moment of change for disrupting habits, including travel habits, and the impacts that that is continuing to have on people's work and working patterns and patterns of travel in terms of leisure, etc. Similarly, we've been looking at aeromobility within higher education and how universities have responded both to the climate emergency and to COVID-19 in terms of their travel, particularly aviation. And we're doing work with several local authorities, including Cornwall Council, to reduce car use amongst staff and residents. You'll hear more about some of the other projects that we've been doing. So these are things that you won't particularly hear about, but there is some more information on our website if you're interested. And we will also be launching today a new report which outlines the findings from the Scottish Government work, which you'll be hearing about in a minute, and the toolkit that we developed with them. So that's available on our website, along with lots of other excellent briefings as well. So I'm going to stop sharing, and at this point, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this session. His name is Bertrand Dess. He is the head of Transport, Climate Change Strategy and Engagement at Transport Scotland. He has a background more in road safety. He was head of road safety policy within Transport Scotland. He also worked on the National Transport Strategy and has recently moved over to focus more on climate change within transport. So we're really delighted that Bertrand is able to speak to us today about what Scottish Government is doing and in fact taking quite a leading position around transport and climate change. So Bertrand, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I think my presentation will be shown in a minute. That's it. I understand that in the audience we may have some other countries, so that they understand. In Scotland, we've got a devolved administration, so we are independent from the UK government in terms of transport, and we report to Scottish ministers. The presentation I'm going to give, next slide, Amiera, please, is about the roadmap, which I can summarize in 2 slides. The Scottish Government has committed to reducing car kilometres by 20% by 2030 from a 2019 baseline as part of the Climate Change Plan update published in December 2020. This policy outcome is a world-leading commitment, demonstrating the level of ambition needed for Scotland to reach net zero. In January 2022, together with the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, we published a roadmap that sets out how we will achieve a national reduction in car use. It includes not only system-level interventions that will support people at the individual level to reduce car use, but also 4 key sustainable travel behaviors for people to consider when planning a journey. The first one is reducing the need to travel, such as by using online options to access goods, services, amenities, and social connections, if these cannot be accessed locally in a sustainable way. The second is living well locally by choosing local destinations which can make it easier to switch to a more sustainable mode and will reduce distances driven if a car is still used. The third behavior is switching modes to walk, wheel, cycle, or use of public transport where feasible. Finally, the combining trips or sharing journeys with another person can be used if the car use remains the only feasible option. The aim of the roadmap and these 4 sustainable travel behavior is to empower people to choose an option that fits their circumstances and travel needs. Next slide. which describes, as I mentioned earlier, the system level interventions. So I won't go through the detail, but you can see that we have taken a systemic approach to this roadmap, where, for example, colleagues in the digital world will help us achieve this route map reduction through a broadband program for providing broadband access for 100% of premises by 2021. You've got also some examples like the 4G infill program to extend 4G coverage across rural Scotland by late 2023, and what we call the snake here. At the end of the snake, you've got in 2025, for example. In my previous role, I was working on rolling out 20 mph speed limits to achieve a safer speed on appropriate roads in bigged up areas. Next slide, please. Why we need this change and I will cover this again in 2 slides. Transport is Scotland's biggest sectoral emitter, accounting for nearly 30% of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. Within that, car travel makes up nearly 40% of transport emissions. Modelling, already published in the Element Energy Report, is clear that technological solutions alone will not be enough to meet our commitment to net zero by 2040. And that we need to reduce the use of private vehicles as well as supporting a transition to lower emission vehicles. Behavioral change will be fundamental requirement to achieve this reduction in car use. And you may have heard that just recently, the UK Parliament House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee published a report stating that 1/3 of emissions cuts in the UK must come from behavioral change. And a public engagement strategy is urgently required by the UK government. As I mentioned when I started, Scotland has a devolved government, so this route map is definitively ahead of what the UK government is doing. Car use reduction supports as well the delivery of our national transport strategy for priorities that are reducing inequalities, taking climate action, delivering inclusive economic growth, and improving health and well-being. Next slide, please. The good news as well is that by doing this, we won't just be helping to tackle climate change. We'll be also helping people live better lives through improved health and well-being and greater social and economic inclusion. The current levels of car use have significant negative impacts, covering health and well-being through poor air quality, road danger, physical inactivity, noise pollution, and community severance. 2, as well, negative impacts on the economy through, for example, congestion. Importantly, these negative impacts all disproportionately affect those who are already more vulnerable. So reducing car use is a key part of Scottish Government's commitment to reducing inequalities. Next slide. As noted in research by the Institute for Public Policy Research, low-income households are lower carbon emitters. They are not driving the climate crisis, nor are they driving most of the cars that fill our cities. Car access and usage is also lower amongst other groups, including women, older and younger people, disabled people, and people of non-white Scottish or British ethnicities. Yet, for many decades, policy and investment decisions have prioritized space and access for car users. This has meant that people that are unable to use a car can be excluded from safely accessing certain destinations, whilst also suffering the negative impacts from other people's car use. We understand that there is no one-size-fits-all, but we believe the route map contains a range of options for everyone, including businesses, to consider. We do not expect car use to reduce equally for all, including some businesses, those in rural areas and those who rely on cars for mobility or other reasons. But for those who are able to change their travel behavior, We want to recognize and enable that. Given this, reducing the dominance and negative impacts of car use are particularly important for current and intergenerational social justice to provide a viable environmental and economic future for subsequent generations in Scotland. Next slide. So on this slide, you can see that data shows us that we need to support people to change their behavior in relation to a range of journey purposes. Currently, community, shopping, and leisure are the most common reasons for car travel. We need to support people to change both long and short trips. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that currently around 4% of our trips account for nearly 30% of the total mileage driven. But at the heart of our roadmap is the recognition that reducing car use will be harder for some groups than others, and a commitment to a fair, or what we call a just transition to lower emissions that does not penalize groups that already suffer from disadvantage. That is why our target is a national one rather than a target for all individuals or communities to reduce car use by the same amount. Next slide. Car use reduction implementation benefits from a number of opportunities, present or future. Scottish Government's recent climate change tracker public opinion survey found that 72% of respondents agreed that the way we live our lives will have to change substantially to address climate change. With a separate survey finding around 50% of respondents agreed it would be possible not to use their car for common trip types. Over 90% of Climate Assembly members selected to be representative of Scottish population agreed that Scottish Government needs to support the transition from car use to public and active travel. We believe businesses have the potential to benefit from car use reduction. First, by removing the barrier of car ownership to access the workplace as an employee or as a customer. Second, local shops will benefit from car-free travel to them as environmental, social, and economic benefits of sustainable travel to localized streets and town centers will accrue from holistic behavioral change to more local living. Third, reducing the volume of vehicles on the road can help create space and improve journey times for those where travel is more car dependent, such as blue badge holders and certain tradespeople, as well as other vehicles such as buses, the emergency services, and freight operators. In 2020, we started to track people's attitudes toward travel and transport to better understand the impacts of the pandemic on travel behaviors. More than half of people recently surveyed told us that the cost of fuel has led to them driving less frequently or for a few miles. And around a third say it's led them to switch to a different mode of transport for some or all of their journeys. And this is where the cost crisis joins the dots with the climate emergency. These changes in behavior, triggered by moments of change and hopefully to be sustained, are good for people's pockets and for the planet. Last bullet point of my slide is that some interventions out with the roadmap have the potential to further support car reduction, such as demand management to discourage car use. Transport Scotland commissioned consultancy analysis from AECOM to explore demand management options. Following a recent sift of all available options, the research will provide detailed appraisal of local and national road user charging schemes, covering quantified climate and economic impacts, including revenue-raising potential. The research will conclude in December, and discussions are ongoing with Minister for Transport regarding the next steps. Finally, car sharing schemes, once again, in this current cost of living should blossom. Members go to get their car when they need it, but in the future and under mobility as a service, their membership to a mass operator will make the connected and autonomous vehicle come to get them, making life so much easier. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the challenges of implementing this car use reduction. The first one is the human behavior, as you know, chooses always the path of least effort. We need to make the path to sustainable travel much easier to see and to use. The pen portraits that have been developed by CAST and Climate Outreach is a superb communications tool for people to visualize the benefit of changing their behaviors based on their own characteristics. And I'm looking forward to get the presentation about this after me. Along with travel time, cost is the most important factor in determining how people choose to travel. This is particularly important given that rail and bus fares in Scotland have risen above general inflation over the last decade, whilst motoring costs have not. At the moment, car is still seen as the most convenient and cost-attractive travel option. It is therefore our task in government to make car use less attractive by making active travel and public transport more convenient and cost-attractive, whilst making car use less convenient and less cost-attractive. Which brings me to the second challenge of limited funding to just do that. One solution to achieve this is partly to implement car demand management schemes. These include, for example, low traffic zones, bans from city centers, traffic calming measures, living street designs, road user charging, such as distance charging, congestion charging, and other levies, such as working place levies, the revenue of which could be reinvested into public transport. That brings me to my third challenge about devolved powers. The main policy levers to disincentivize car use, fuel duty and vehicle excise duty, are reserved to the UK government. And despite approaches from Scottish ministers, no meaningful dialogue on this issue has been forthcoming. The cost crisis and rises in the cost of fuel underline the unfairness and unviability of the status quo, particularly here in Scotland. The Scottish Government will continue to press for a fair and progressive future transport tax system that reduces unnecessary journeys, raises revenues to fund policies to support a shift to more sustainable travel, and better incentivizes the transition to zero-emission vehicles for those who need them. Finally, the interventions set out in the route map will take time to be fully implemented and make effects. That is why we forecast that car use reduction will really start to be statistically significant from 2025 onwards, only 5 years before the target of 2030. This brings both a reporting risk as well as a delivery risk that I need to manage over time. And this concludes my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bertrand. I will give a talk now about how CAST has supported this work, and then we can have a Q&A at the end for anyone who, I'm sure many people have questions for you. So I'm just going to share my slides now. All right, so my name's Amiera. I'm the Director of Programmes and Research at Climate Outreach, and we are part of the CAST consortium. And so the main thing that we work on with CAST is the engagement side. Climate Outreach is an organisation that's very much focused on public engagement on climate change based on research and evidence. And we were approached, CAST was approached by, that jumped forward by itself, was approached by the Scottish Government, Transport Scotland, to support them really to think through effective communications around the route map. And I've listed my project colleagues there, Lorraine, Dan, Cal and Annayah, who are mostly with us today and definitely available for answering questions. So Bertrand has already given a really good background into the important kind of role that transport plays in emissions and emissions reduction. So I'm not going to go into that, but the kind of 4 areas that are really kind of helpful, that are sort of mapped out in the route map. Areas of focus are reducing the need to travel, living well locally, switching modes, and combining or sharing car trips, as was already laid out. So when we were approached by Transport Scotland, sort of the main question that they had is there a way that we can develop some form of evidence-based tool to think through how to effectively engage different audiences who would want to engage with those 4 areas, but maybe there are barriers to that engagement. Maybe they're material barriers, or maybe it's barriers around the communication style. You know, what would actually engage them and make them feel that they have the agency to take action in those different areas. So since this is something that we do, doing research with publics to understand how they respond to different climate related messages, we were really excited to be a part, to do a small part really in this. So what did we do in this project specifically? Obviously, public engagement is key to delivering the changes set out in the route map. And of course, there are wide-ranging changes infrastructurally as well, but there is a need to understand people's needs and values and build buy-in over time to these different potential changes. So what we did was review the evidence of Scottish public opinion of climate and car reduction policies and the factors shaping travel choices, especially wherever we could find evidence related to car use reduction in Scotland. Then we co-developed with the government some hypothetical pen portraits of 6 categories of stakeholder, describing how they have engaged with policies in the route map, under the route map, and adapted their lives to use cars less, and what the benefits or the challenges of those transitions may have been. And really the aim being to communicate that the change is possible, and there are co-benefits to it. But we wanted to obviously do this in a way which is evidence-based. So we use the original evidence base, the literature review, to inform the development of those 6 pen portraits, but then we tested their validity through quantitative and qualitative means, including interviews and focus group discussions with individuals that represented those 6 segments, and then we refined them afterwards. We refined them and then we tested them through experimental surveys just to ensure we sort of went beyond the sample size of the focus groups and interviews. And then we also worked with a design agency to produce illustrations of the pen portraits, just to sort of bring them to life in a way which felt quite engaging. So as I mentioned, we had the literature review, we had 7 online focus groups, each with 2 to 4 participants representing those 6 groups who I'll go into shortly, and then solo interviews. And then on the survey, as you can see, and you can see the 6 groups there, largely, it was about 100 to 200 participants per group. But what did the literature review tell us? I don't want to kind of go over some of the useful stuff already shared, but there are key influences on travel choice which are related to geography, particularly the division between rural and islanders or urban, age and generation. So the number of miles driven does tend to increase with age. There are gender responsivity issues in transport, so women largely reporting feeling less safe and less supported to use different forms of transport. Income, obviously 29% of households in Scotland don't have access to a car, but public transport so far has not necessarily always been convenient for their specific needs. So that might be work timings, for example, being outside of the 9 to 5, largely the busy schedule of 9 to 5, and then the lived experience of people with disabilities. There being many challenges, as there are globally, around access, inclusion, and also the kind of the psychological impacts of trying to access transport. A lot of anxiety and feeling like being left behind. So for a lot of people, cars represent security, flexibility, and convenience. And while there are flexible transport services there, the literature told us that there are some challenges with accessing those for wide groups. On public engagement with travel reduction specifically, it was quite interesting. The public in Scotland overwhelmingly support a structural shift to reduce dependency on cars, as Bertrand already said. The feasibility does depend on location. So as I mentioned, you tend to see a bit more nervousness from people living on the islands or people in rural areas. And people in Glasgow were more positive about reducing car use than people in Aberdeen in one of the studies. And there are some journeys that people struggle to imagine doing without access to a car. So like big grocery shopping visits, for example, visiting friends and family in far like more remote or rural places, and things like leisure trips with children where the logistics of it felt like too much to imagine taking public transport. And there's this kind of fear of, you know, changing travel habits is going to be difficult and expensive. So there's not a lack of wanting to do it. It's that sense of empowerment and agency in actually doing it. But thankfully, Scotland has a public engagement strategy. And so I don't have time to go into it now, but you can easily access it online. And the framework for engagement is it's evidence-based. They worked with various stakeholders, including CAST and climate outreach, in the development of the public engagement strategy. But there are 3 strategic objectives: to understand people, different people, and how to communicate climate change with them, to facilitate their participation in policy design, and to encourage action. And there are principles underpinning the public engagement strategy about inclusivity, putting people at the heart of decision making, being evidence-based, a just transition, being open and transparent, and also the kind of positive of the transition. But coming back to the pen portraits specifically, 6 were developed, so I'll just talk through them very briefly. So the first one was Mary and Jonathan, an older couple living in a rural area, so perhaps in the demographic that does rely on cars quite a lot. Alex, a young adult living in an urban area, and this was somebody who had shifted when they started their university degree. And they'd shifted with an old car, you know, a family car, and over time became disincentivized from using it and shifted to other modes. Naya and John, middle-income parents with young children, office workers who had shifted already a bit during the COVID lockdowns and seen some of the sort of benefits of the impacts of COVID on people's work mobilities. Kim, a single parent on a lower income. Yasmin, a small business owner in a small town, and Mike, an office worker and wheelchair user. So I'm just going to talk through one in detail, but they're all in the report that we're going to share later today. So yeah, it would take me forever to go through them all, but I feel quite personally quite passionate about them because of the work that we did sort of test them and evolve them. So Alex, a young adult living in an urban area that I'd mentioned. So Alex moved from a rural area to a city when they started university. They brought the sort of old car in from the family because that felt the most economical for them to get around. They felt that trains were very expensive. They weren't necessarily on the schedules that felt convenient and possible. But over time, using the car did start to become challenging. So finding parking was becoming more challenging. The upkeep costs of the car, because it was quite old, so not passing the MOT or having challenges with the battery and then needing to pay for those, and then sort of the low emission zone being introduced. So eventually, in their own cost benefit analysis, they chose to get rid of the car, to use public transport, walk more and wheel more. And there were many kind of benefits of that, of taking those choices. And also they learned that public transport wasn't expensive as they thought it was, and they could access some of the places that they didn't think were possible, for example, in the Highlands areas. So they got a young person's rail card. They started car sharing for certain trips with friends. So for example, trips away, or trips that felt that they weren't possible to do without a car physically. And then they also joined a cycling group through a Facebook group and started to really enjoy cycling and made new friends that way and really built their confidence. So the kind of outcome of this shift was firstly health and well-being benefits, feeling fitter, but feeling more connected socially through car sharing, through the cycling groups, and also geographically visiting more of the Highlands and other areas. So I can just show you briefly what this looks like in text. Oh, you can't see it there, but we have a very, quite a long, like 1-page description of that story with where they were in the beginning, what was starting to shift, the changes that they made and the benefits of the changes. And we have that for each of those. So those were tested by the participants and evolved, but this is a shortened version. So how did this pen portrait evolve through the testing? So the large majority of respondents found it to be realistic. They felt that the most realistic elements were things like shifting from habitual car use to bike use, kind of the perception that cars are needed to reach rural and leisure areas. So that felt like it really resonated with people, young people that we spoke to. So that's something that could be a perception that could be shifted, but there was openness to using public transport with more information and affordability, and also the convenience of public transport in cities made it feel like it was realistic and possible for this person to make that shift. So they emphasized to us, please do say more about the importance of affordability of making the switch to public transport and other forms, and emphasize that the transition to bike use might not be that easy for everybody, you know, like don't make the assumption that all young people could just shift to bikes. So we did that. The second one, I don't have time to talk through now, but here's just an example of Annayah and John who had shifted partly because of the COVID lockdown impacts, but also partly because their children were encouraging them to make environmentally conscious choices and walk more because of what they were learning at school. So a lot of people really felt that this felt really realistic, considering their own lifestyles and the people that they know. So just to summarize, you know, how realistic and relevant did people find these different pen portraits? So you can see here from our survey, so we have the bars there. Each bar represents a different group that was tested, from people, you know, middle class couple, to the young person, to a rural/islander, somebody from a low-income family, a business owner, and a person living with a disability. And as you can see, on realisticness, the people living with disabilities felt that the portrait for theirs was the most realistic compared to the other groups, although they did feel on average that they were realistic, which was good. Relevance, you can see that the Annayah and John example was the most popular, felt them having the highest relevance to that particular group. But again, you know, from 1 being not relevant at all to 3 being completely relevant, that's not bad. The business owner one is a bit lower because of the sort of slightly harder to imagine relationship between making this shift and economic benefits, or at least managing to do that, particularly as a small business owner. And I think that, you know, we all felt that there was more scope for more information to build people's confidence and around that. So when we asked them how much did the scenario make them feel they could reduce car use, the scores were lower, but not completely, you know, unrealistic. So that was useful to know, but it does suggest to us that, you know, a journey of messaging for different groups is going to be important. There's a lot on this slide, so I'm not expecting everybody to be able to read it, but just we wanted to ask people, once they'd engaged with the pen portraits, about their intentions to engage in pro-environmental transport behaviours afterwards. And as you can see across the board, there's fairly good scores there. So 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. So, you know, people generally agree that they intend to cut down their travel related emissions in the next 6 months. They tend to agree that they're, you know, quite strongly overall that they want to use more active forms of travel. Public transport was a little bit lower overall, but, you know, once they hear some of the communications related to the route map, I have confidence that will shift. In reducing car use, there is agreement there. That's the first set of bars. And the other one that was quite interesting was using more local destinations, for example, local shops. So the 20-minute neighbourhood part, more intention to engage with that. And then overall support for car reduction policies we asked about. I mean, again, I have lots of graphs and they're all going in our report, but the summary of that is there was very high support across all car reduction related policies, especially the 20-minute neighbourhoods, the investment in infrastructure, mobility hubs and concessionary bus fares and cycle related schemes. There was lower support, but it was still high, which is important for low emission zones and Work Local Challenges programme. And when it came to the route map specifically, it was generally quite supported with a high of 4.19, so 5 being that people support it, 1 being that they don't, and a low of 3.79 from people in rural or island areas, and people in rural and island areas generally were the least confident of all the policies, but I think that makes sense given their locations geographically. So I think it's probably a concern about whether those policies are going to reach them. So in conclusion, we feel that, you know, it's really great that there are positive attitudes towards car reduction, and a lot can be done with that. The end of COVID-19 represent a really important window of opportunity to reduce car use. And what we learned from this and also previous evidence is that living well locally, emphasis could really be made on that. That really resonated with people. The transition to a healthier way of mobility, so walking, wheeling, cycling, combining and sharing car trips is something that actually people responded to, and a number of people in our survey said they already did it. So, and the people who said they did it were more likely to be positive about it. So that's something that was quite insightful for us. Of course, switching is more difficult for some groups. And so interventions and public campaigns do need to consider that. And finally, working with businesses could really help to reduce car use. We've got more specific recommendations in the report, but I will stop there. All right, we're slightly running over time, but I'm conscious people are going to have questions, particularly probably for Bertrand. So I'm going to look at the Q&A. And yes, so we have one question at the moment. Perhaps if you could put your video on, Bertrand, do you think that might be possible? Just so participants have the pleasure of seeing you. So the question is, a key barrier to switching to more sustainable forms of transportation are the extortionate prices of train tickets. It's way cheaper to fly to many places compared to taking a train. What is being done to make train transport more accessible?
I've tried to put my video, but it doesn't allow me. You can't see me? No?
We can't, but no worries. Please do go ahead.
Yes, so we are definitively aware that at the moment transport by train is still very expensive, especially cross-border services between Scotland and the rest of the UK. In Scotland, what the government has achieved so far, and we have announced this in the latest programme for government, is to freeze the potential increase of rail fares until March of next year, which help some users not to spend too much money on train going forward, at least until March. We also recognize that demand management on aviation may become something that the Scottish government may need to look going forward. We still don't have any ministerial commitment on this, but we recognize that if we want people to use better sustainable travel, including train, we need to make traveling by plane more expensive. And I think Lorraine mentioned, you know, the frequent flyer levy. This would be something that we would look going forward. But once again, for those folks on the call, there's no commitment at this time. We are not preparing anything like this, just in the air. Yeah, and that would be my response.
Thank you so much. All right, so there's another question here from Hannah. Doing a full segmentation study from scratch is the gold standard, but also expensive and time consuming. Are you able from your Scotland work or elsewhere to draw any correlations between the BTC segments and travel attitudes so that the existing BTC data could be used to support an understanding of travel behavior, change options slash messages? So I can answer that one. So what we did here was we looked in to the BTC data specifically in Scotland. So I had the joy of, it was actually very interesting, of digging through all of the Scottish data and doing an analysis of it kind of on its own and then next to the wider data across the UK. What we learned there was quite a lot of similarities, but that there were greater segments who tended to be frustrated and feel a bit disengaged. So the proportion of those segments were a bit higher. Having said that, the data showed that there was still, across the segments overall, sort of positive responses to travel-related policies. So yeah, that's what we could manage to sort of dig out there is in the report that we're launching today. I think is going on the CAS website. So yes, I agree with you, Hannah, but it is expensive and time consuming. So there is a kind of balance with looking at the evidence we already have and then doing new segmentations. The next question that I can see is, how do you propose to tackle the negative response to measures to reduce vehicle use when it often seems to provoke an extreme public response, e.g. the clean air zone in Manchester? I have thoughts on that, but in case Bertrand wants to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Amiera. The overall aspect of it is really getting buy-in from all car users, explaining, as you said in your slides, about the public engagement strategy, that we communicate in a transparent way what we are trying to achieve and what we want road users to achieve. It's not just telling them stop using your cars, but is to providing them also with the capability to do so without bringing further difficulties to them. I mentioned also the path to an easier way to use sustainable travel. But over in a grand scheme of things, the overall effort from me is to convince what we call the diehard, the petrol heads, that it is important for them as well to, if they are able to change their behavior, to do so. And I'm completely aware that it's a difficult discussion with them, but this is a discussion that we need to have with them.
Thank you so much. I see so many interesting questions coming in, but we are running behind time, so I'm going to move us on now. So thank you so much. And I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Angela Mae Minas, who is going to speak to us today with our second case study. So I will let you introduce yourself. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you, Amiera. I hope I'm able to share my screen now. Is that visible to everyone? Okay, perfect. Hello, I am Angela, as introduced by Amiera, and I have the privilege of sharing with you insights from our work with the community-led initiative in Manchester, in England, which aims to co-create solutions for reducing car use for short journeys. And I am presenting this on behalf of my colleague Sarah Mander and our partners from Our Streets Chorlton. To give you a bit of an overview of the next few minutes where I talk about the initiative, this shows you the outline. So first I'll talk to you about Our Streets Chorlton and why we conceptualize it as a protective space for grassroots innovation. And then I'll give you an overview of the methods that we use to understand how this type of innovation looks like in practice, contextualizing it in Chorlton, and why this area is relevant for exploring low carbon travel. The findings I'll present by reflecting on Our Streets Chorlton as an innovation niche, and I hope I can explain that more clearly later. But basically, it will go around the importance of social networks, of learning, of aligning expectations and enrollment, or knowing who the actors that would be needed to support the transformation, and also the resources. So to begin with, Our Streets Chorlton, this is a lottery-funded initiative. They were recipients of the National Lottery's Community Climate Action Fund in 2020, and its focus is mainly on low-carbon transport. the community wanted to reduce car use for short journeys. Its core group consists of 9 partners, and key to OS's objectives is to engage with the local community to co-design greener, safer streets that would lead to reduction in car travel. This involved understanding factors that shape the travel decisions, gathering data on pollution, emissions, and traffic, and developing a local support network to empower the community. In our research, so we came in here as a researcher, but Our Streets Chorlton is very much a grassroots initiative, and we did our best to be as embedded as possible. But putting on a researcher hat, we understand Our Streets Chorlton as a grassroots innovation, meaning it is a network of actors and activists and organizations that work together to co-create bottom-up solutions. And conceptualizing it as a niche innovation because these dedicated grassroots actors, the ones from the community, are the ones who are challenging existing regimes, which is the use of cars for short journeys. And they are the ones driving practices. And as I've mentioned earlier, when I explain some of the findings, reflect on them, we look into their social networks, the learning that transpires, the expectations, and how they involve the actors and resources in driving that transformation. We did interviews with the community, surveys, and we also referred to reports and documents which are publicly available at the Our Streets Chorlton website here on the screen if you want to have a look. Over the course of 18 months, from July 2020 to March 2022, Our Streets Chorlton co-developed a program of activities with community groups and members. There were 2 open streets, where 2 residential streets were closed through traffic for a period of 3 days, with a program of events delivered on the streets during those days. There were also school streets where similarly they were closed to traffic, and engaged a local primary school. There were data champions. They are volunteers from the community who are collecting or counting traffic data. Community members were also asked to complete surveys, whilst others got involved in a more workshop type intervention via the Inspired Community Action Program. So all of these are delivered through the Our Streets Chorlton initiative. Now, to give you more background about the place itself, Chorlton is in Manchester. It's about 3 miles south of the city center. And if we plot their map with a place-based carbon calculator, it shows that the carbon emissions per person in Chorlton are above national average. You can see the dark orange and red areas here. It stands out compared to its neighboring areas or boroughs. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a high level of car ownership in Chorlton. It is a more affluent area than the rest of Manchester. It has high social capital. And when we ask people what they like about Chorlton, they speak positively about the place. 63% of the respondents said that the best things about the area are its local independent shops. So giving us a sense of how people travel in and around Chorlton, whether or not they live in the area or they live in the neighboring boroughs, they go to Chorlton for its independent shops and businesses. 51% like Chorlton's bars and restaurants. Those who live in Chorlton, they also value the green spaces and its sense of community. Now, this photo is from Google Earth, and it gives you a sense of the impact that vehicles have on many streets. It has high levels of ownership, streets narrowed by parking, and a problem with pavement parking. The words here in the middle, when we asked them in the survey to describe Chorlton in 3 words, these are the ones that came out. So there is a positive feeling, but cars are a problem. Those who live locally, they walk, they wheel, they cycle, but the cars are used mostly to travel, most commonly to travel outside the area. And it's very useful on a personal level, we found. For example, transporting stuff, and if they have passengers, for reliability and flexibility. They're also, because when we did this around lockdown, on and off lockdown time, there were also concerns about COVID. But whether or not they cycle around Chorlton, they wheel, or they travel actively, or they drive, people have poor experiences of travel. So this group of words here are those who travel actively. These are the words that they use to describe, and these are the ones that are used by those who were driving. And when we ask them more generally to describe the impact of motor vehicles in the area, 98% of respondents use negative words. So whether or not they drive, it's a negative experience. Now, reflecting on that, on Chorlton itself, its challenges for reducing car use, and the perspective of Our Streets Chorlton as a protective space for grassroots innovations. The next set of slides, I'll talk to you about some findings from our work. So one is on social networks. Our Streets Chorlton's work, because of their work, they engaged in conversations with the community around active travel. We learned that they were taking on a bridging role, connecting one actor to the other, whether or not it's local groups to the wider community, or for example, connecting them to more to their local councillors, for example. And these all contributes to increasing interest in making low carbon travel choices. They have very tangible on the ground activities, such as those that I've described earlier, the open streets, the data champion, traffic counting. And these all build and strengthen social networks between community members, project partners, and other local stakeholders. This one is a photo from their open streets. You can see here, there were also traffic counting that's happening on the side, how cycling went up and driving went down. We found really that engagement activities like this start discussions and build engagement. The conversations that happen here also create spaces for learning, which leads me to the second point of what we learned about bottom-up initiatives for reducing car use. It's that if community members are engaged in learning processes, they become empowered. In the case of OSC, they learned about the relationship of traffic and air quality and speeding. And this was very important to demonstrate a case for change. They also learned about how to use existing council powers, traffic orders for school streets and parklets. So say, for example, through the collaboration with the city council, OSC discovered that they could use existing traffic orders in a more extensive and creative way. That resulted in a 3-day closure using the orders that are already in place in the city. They conducted play streets, and this opened up opportunities for other groups to do more in the future. Another one is the parklets. So this is where what would normally be spaces for cars would be used for community activities. Manchester City Council do not currently have any formal or written guidance about parklets. And since the activity, conversations have started, and they know now with the community as well that other councils in the UK are developing policies towards parklets and similar community initiatives. So now there's an opportunity to work together to help officers grow understanding about ways that parklets can be introduced safely. Another aspect of niche innovations is about expectations, that articulating expectations helps to identify who exactly need to be involved and what resources will be needed to achieve the goals of the project. So in Our Streets Chorlton, other than the surveys, they also went to schools. And when pupils were asked to imagine their streets, there was an overwhelming desire for greener areas. Pupils felt there wasn't enough space for them to hang out with friends after school. Parks were inaccessible for half the year due to dark evenings. They have a variety of ideas, and one that came up was community-owned places. But then again, delivering these expectations requires support from the government actors as well as resources. And reflecting on the fact that OSC was a funded initiative, we know from our academic work and seeing it happen on the ground that there was definitely a need to align the expectations of the funder with the resources and capacities and expectations of the community, because more often than not, that may not be on the same page. Other than that, and one of the final points that I want to make in terms of understanding this grassroots innovation to transform low carbon travel is on enrollment of actors and resources. OSC was very good at giving a platform for seldom heard voices, those who are most disadvantaged by unsafe roads. These are children, non-car owners, older people. And we've learned that amplifying the voices of local people and enabling access to better information definitely enhances conversation with council representatives, which allows them to drive action at systems level. So there were many small-scale interventions, but these allowed people, especially those in the community, to build an appetite, ability, and trust for greater, more complex changes. And we see it happening that the partnerships built have the potential to enable systematic changes that's required from a climate change perspective and from the transformation that's required to reduce car use. So overall, we understand that OSC's work was really great in engaging the community, but for it to transform practices requires normalization of sustainable travel practices and support. Practices are shaped by infrastructure, material design, and knowledge, but these are only limited, or they can be limited by, for example, the lack of infrastructure. So options for doing things differently are constrained by all these resources and capacities that may not be available. Definitely, there is a need to support people to reduce car use. If we want them to shift to low carbon travel choices, we can't leave it to the capacities or agencies of the people alone, because normal looks different to everyone. So people who have, for example, commitments for parenting, caring for others, work or leisure, they will probably need, their sense of normal is different for when they need their cars or when they don't. And transport choices must fit with everyday life. So for example, I guess hopefully to illustrate that, if what we learned a lot from this project is that even if there is a willingness, even if there's a sense for how to transform travel choices, transport infrastructures will be needed. There should be support for the community, more fund, and I think maybe Bertrand also mentioned this earlier, funding will be needed to shape all of these from happening. This is just to give you an overview from the survey that we did. Transport infrastructure is really one of the key things that people think that people say will be needed for them to shift their travel choices. And finally, in summary, if we are to transform the way we travel to adopt low carbon options, we learned from this bottom-up initiative that it definitely requires policy support and action from everyone involved. More specifically, starting with building and strengthening social networks, these connections that are needed to make things happen, engaging in learning processes and understanding and aligning expectation of stakeholders. And once we know those expectations and align those expectations, then hopefully we'll be able to pinpoint who the necessary actors and what resources will be needed to make that happen. Sorry, I think I went a bit over time, but I hope that's all right. Just to share, thank you so much for this is a thank you for those who are involved in the initiative. Again, like I am in a privileged position to be sharing this, but all the work has been done by our partners in Our Streets Chorlton. Our email addresses are there if you want to contact us about this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So interesting. We're getting some clapping hands from participants there, which is great. We're running a little bit behind time, so I definitely don't want to stifle questions to you, Angela. So I'm going to encourage participants to keep sending questions, but definitely write if you have a direct question for Angela, and she'll be able to type a response, and we'll have some hopefully time for discussion at the end. Thank you so much. So I'm now going to hand over to Stuart Capstick, who's going to talk to us about a car-free cities initiative across different cities. Thank you.
Thanks, Amiera. Just try and make this thing work. File. No, not that one. There we go. Okay, is that looking okay?
Yeah.
Hopefully, thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Stuart Capstick. I'm a senior research fellow at Cardiff University, and I'm particularly involved in theme 3 of the CAST Centre that Lorraine mentioned at the start. That's the trialling, the learning by doing theme. So I'm going to talk to you about an initiative that was actually set up by the charity Possible, and which CAST researchers have been helping to understand in a bit more detail. So the Going Car Free trial that I'll talk about is part of a bigger set of projects organised by Possible. I'll say a little bit about those, but just sort of sketch in summary, really. I'll mostly want to talk about participants' experience, the volunteers' experiences of the Going Car Free trial as told to us as researchers. And I'll try and draw out a few lessons and recommendations from the trial. So to give a bit of wider context, the charity Possible is campaigning and helping to set up various projects under the umbrella of car-free cities. This includes some citizen science work. They've been helping set up parklets at the community level. Jella talked a little bit about parklets in relation to her project, so trying to set up more kind of pleasant and creative and interesting spaces as opposed to parking a car. So Possible is also campaigning and trying to help with play streets and school streets, working on low traffic neighbourhoods. But the particular part of their car-free cities work that we in CAST have been doing our research on is linked to their Going Car Free trials. So the trials themselves, this was done earlier this year in 4 cities in England, so Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds and London. It was a fairly small scale trial, but with the idea that it can kind of show a proof of concept and draw out some lessons from the experiences of people who have tried it. So there were 12 people initially recruited to the trial, 3 in each of those 4 cities. They were recruited primarily via social media and word of mouth. Of those 12 people, 2 did drop out for personal reasons, but 10 saw the trial through from start to finish. It's important to say that all of the people who took part in the Going Car Free trial were people who drove regularly. Most also owned cars. So these weren't people who already cycled everywhere. In fact, some of the people in the trial were self-confessed kind of lovers of their cars, but they all saw the appeal for one reason or another of trying to go car free. So the volunteer participants came from a range of experiences and backgrounds. Most of them had caring responsibilities. And the main idea of the Going Car Free trial is that these volunteers, these participants, signed up to do a 3-week car-free trial in the second half of January and February. So they agreed to give it a go, to give up their car. And they had support from project officers working for Possible in each of those cities, including things like giving them advice on alternatives, in some cases things like training to develop their confidence with cycling or access to bikes and so on. And the volunteers filled in surveys throughout the trial and were interviewed before, during and after it. Yeah, so just a note to say that in terms of the research approach, Possible collected data from surveys and also made some calculations about emissions savings and other outcomes. And in CAST, we carried out interviews with the participants both immediately as the trial ended, so in around mid-February, and then again, we spoke to people about 3 months after the end of the trial. And those interviews were done by several different researchers at Cardiff, Manchester, and Bristol, including me. Some of the preliminary analysis and findings that I'll talk about has been done by a researcher called Lily Waples at Bristol University, and we're building on this at the moment. But I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about these findings. I did want to make the slight caveat that the data we've got is still being analysed, so we're still working through it to write this up for research papers and so on. So on to those research findings. In our conversations with the participants, they gave a range of reasons for why they used or relied on cars. Some of these are quite familiar, really, with anyone who's done research or work in this area, and are kind of quite common sense. So people refer to things like the convenience of cars, that you can work to your own time, as this first participant puts it. Another interviewee refers to the safety of using a private car, and this third person here also talks about how the immediate the accessibility to a vehicle, in their case, led to it being regularly used. So I should say in this slide and most of the remaining ones, the remarks in the quote marks here are verbatim from the interviews we did with participants. So people use their cars, they found them convenient and so on. But despite the regular car use that people were doing, all of the people involved in the trial were nevertheless motivated enough to give the car-free trial a go. And a few different reasons were given by people for why they wanted to take part in the trial. These included things like the downsides of driving, congestion, being stuck in traffic, the costs of a car, environmental reasons. So as the first participant here puts it, they felt some guilt, some personal bad feeling about contributing to transport emissions. People also said that they were motivated by the challenge of giving up the car for a few weeks. So as this second quote here puts this, why not give it a whirl, see if it works? And I thought it was interesting that versions of that sentiment came up a lot in the interviews, that people wanted to sort of take this challenge, see how they got on with it. Now, when we look at people's actual experiences of the car-free trial, that experience, the learning by doing, was mentioned as important, as valuable by pretty much everyone we spoke to. So doing the trial was felt to be good first-hand experience, as this first quote puts it. So they said that it was so motivating to them, this first person, that it even led to them selling their car. The second participant here talks about how the trial was set up to run in January and February, which in the UK is pretty much the worst weather we have. And as they saw this in terms of kind of taking on this challenge, it meant that if they felt that if they could do this in the cold, then they could do it anytime. And they were, as they say, pleasantly surprised at how they were able to do it. And the third person here also says that taking on the challenge made them realize that it is possible to reduce their car use, that they found it doable, easy, and straightforward. People referred to a range of positive benefits or co-benefits from taking part in the trial. These included benefits to physical and mental health, having more quality time with their children, spending less time in traffic, as well as financial benefits. And the first quote here shows that the interviewees' experience of walking more, in their case, was very positive for them. They don't want to stop walking now that they have made that shift. They're getting more exercise, having more quality time with their children. And the second quote here also backs this up from another participant, that in their case, in the context of cycling, they feel healthier for doing this rather than being sat in a car. And to back up the kind of financial point for this third participant here, they talk about how they actually made money back from selling their car and were able to buy an electric bike. And I found it particularly interesting to see how the other people kind of around the participants, that the people they had relationships with, fitted into the picture when it came to this trial, in terms of things like offering encouragement, the ripple effects they had on other people, that it was a conversation starter, and so on. So this first participant here talks in a very favorable way about how their two grandchildren loved the cargo bike that they were able to use as part of the trial. They were happy using it, that their kids noticed changes in the weather. They talked to each other, and it was a really lovely experience for them. Someone else mentions that their family was surprised that they took part, but that they were very supportive and proud of them. And the third person here mentions that as a direct result of taking part in the trial, their own father actually started to cycle, which I think is a kind of really nice and unexpected outcome. One thing that seemed to be an obstacle for some people, particularly in terms of starting to cycle, was the image of that stereotypical cyclist. So as this first person says here, they thought to themselves, how am I going to fit in with the other cyclists? Because I see all the cyclists wearing all these tight pants and stuff. So the image of the kind of lycra clad cyclist was off-putting to a lot of people. Another participant also reflected that in the Black community, she felt that it's very rare to see people cycling, that as she put this, we just don't see it as something for us to be doing. But that counter to that, she then reflected that she felt there was space and opportunity for everybody. A lot of people talked about how their perspectives had changed as a result of doing the trial. So this first person here reflects that they used to drive just a 3-minute walk down the road, and they have a very different view on that now. We know, of course, from other research that a lot of car journeys are very short journeys that most people could probably do by foot but don't. And so in this person's case, that they were prompted away from that sort of journey. The second person here talked about how they felt people are hooked on their cars and it's necessary to wean ourselves off them. That's quite an interesting addiction metaphor from that participant, I think. And the third person here talks about how they acquired a different mindset in their own terms, having put themselves in the shoes of a cyclist, that they could see things from both sides now, both as how drivers see cyclists, but also how cyclists see the roads from that point of view. And in terms of kind of anyone interested in thinking about these sorts of trials and extending them and doing them elsewhere, I thought it was an interesting reflection from one of the participants that they felt the trial itself was very good value for money, that it costs money to support people and to set these things up, but they felt that it was very much worth it if it has that bigger and longer term influence on how people travel. People's experiences weren't uniformly positive, so quite a few people had negative experiences of public transport, in a couple of cases saying they didn't want to go near buses again. So there were comments on things like buses having very inconvenient routes, people missing events and appointments because they tried to use the buses and had trouble with them, someone being put off trains due to cancellations, another person who was injured trying to use the bus because it pulled away and they fell. And someone else also was saying that for their accommodation where they lived in a flat, it wasn't practical to store a bike, and so they reluctantly couldn't carry on using it, a bike. So Possible did a bit of number crunching based on the participant surveys, and these suggested that for the most part there was a very positive impact on both people's carbon emissions and weekly expenses. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that most people's carbon emissions from travel dropped over the trial. On the right-hand side, you can see that most people had lower travel expenses, although that wasn't the case for everyone. So a couple of reflections on this trial. I think for me, it paints a very compelling picture of a way to prompt new attitudes and practices. One of the participants, I didn't show the quote, but actually talked about taking part being a life-changing experience to how she approached getting around. But the extent to which this sort of trial works does depend on the extent to which alternatives are attractive. So for many people, switching to walking and cycling is positive, but the experience of public transport was definitely more mixed. And so if you're going to give going car-free a try and it's unpleasant, you might just go back to the car. I think it made a difference that people were part of a project that offered support and advice and helped them to make this change. And there was a lot of value in the experimentation aspect of this, the learning by doing part that people experience through doing the trial, breaking habits, questioning their assumptions. I think a nice outcome of the trial was that participation had a lot of benefits beyond just emissions reduction. So there's air pollution reduction, emissions, but also positive experiences with family and friends, improved health, financial savings, and so on. So that's all I had time to say about this trial. There is some more information about Possible's work on the web here. And you can also read some more detailed case studies of the people who participated. There's some really interesting and quite lovely personal stories there. Yeah, so there's the URLs there. And in CAST, we will also be writing up our research findings in the usual way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stuart. So interesting. And I'm sure, yeah, we're getting some clapping hands coming through there. I don't know if you can see them. So what I'm going to suggest now is we've got 8 minutes to past, but I'm going to say let's take it to 35 minutes past. Obviously, some people will need to leave. We completely understand that, but it'd be great to have a bit of a discussion if possible. So anybody attending would like to put their hand up, and we can see whether we can have some questions where we have the pleasure of seeing your faces and hearing your voices. So questions for Stuart or anybody else who's presented today. I'll have to give you permission to talk, so it might take a second. Perhaps, sorry, go ahead, Lorraine.
Sorry, Amiera. I was just going to say there's a good question by Stuart Matheson in the Q&A actually, and I was curious if Stuart, our Stuart, had an answer to that about do people actually need to stop owning cars to really reduce car use?
Well, I think probably the answer to that is yes. I mean, it's not something that comes directly from the research I was talking about. I did look at the participants, and I know there are at least a couple of people from Possible there, so they might want to chip in as well. But I mean, one thing that did come from the interviews is that people said, well, there was one person I think who had a van, and they said they got a dirty diesel van that was just for their, going on holiday, a camper van, and they thought they were just going to use it for that. But because it was outside the house, because it was an easily accessible thing, they used it frequently. So, I mean, yeah, and as the question sort of implies, once you've got that thing outside the house, you've paid the upfront cost, it's just much easier to jump in it. So, I mean, this is the difficult bit that I guess councils, national governments, it's harder to deal with that, isn't it? Sort of reducing car ownership. But yeah, I mean, fewer cars for sure.
Thanks, Stuart. I am wondering, I'm not seeing anyone's hands going up, but I'm seeing there's a couple of questions. There's one question in there that perhaps Bertrand can answer. So somebody asked earlier, do you think a similar train ticket scheme to the one which ran in Germany this past summer would be possible in Scotland or the UK?
Yeah, I was aware of this scheme, but I think we modeled, or actually in Germany, we had various modeling work with regard cost, and it was not completely positive in terms of the benefits or impact. So it's really inconclusive, I would say. If you decide, I think it was a fixed cost, for the travel journey, like €2 within a city area within Germany. It really depends on the impact, the economic impact assessment of such schemes.
Thank you so much. I can't see any hands going up, so if anyone's having trouble accessing that raise hand function, please feel free to message us and I'll make sure to let you come in. We had another question. I'm just having a look now. Verena from Kogo. What is everybody's top low-hanging fruit for behaviour change initiatives that we should know? I think I might start by asking Lorraine if she has any thoughts on that.
Well, straying slightly outside of land-based transport, I want to give maybe the example of frequent flyer levy. I did mention it earlier, and it was when we did our research with Ipsos Mori, we did a report recently called Net Zero Living, and we found that frequent flyer levies were the most popular net zero policy amongst the UK public. So a large majority supported it, and I think that's because it was seen as being fair, because it kind of embodies the polluter pays principle. So the more you fly, the more tax effectively you pay. So it disincentivizes people from flying more than, say, once a year or so. So it doesn't mean that people have to completely give up flying, but it just means that actually people don't fly so often. And we know that it is the wealthier people who are flying the most as well. So it kind of captures that inequality that we know to be the case with regards kind of carbon footprints as well. So I think that would be maybe my top one, but of course it also has to be accompanied with subsidizing other modes of transport. As somebody mentioned earlier, train travel is very expensive. So if we're able to use the revenues from, say, something like a frequent flyer levy to reduce the price of rail travel to enable us to travel more sustainably, that combination would be very powerful, I think. So we often look at kind of policy bundles as being really important. So one thing by itself tends not to be necessarily very effective, but in combination, several initiatives can be really powerful. So that would be my suggestion.
Thanks. How about Angela? Any thoughts? Any different thoughts?
Nothing more really. I guess it's just to make a point as well that at least from a behavior change perspective and what we see from Our Streets Chorlton, because so basically it's the project definitely did a lot of engagement and awareness raising, and it's just recognizing that it more often than not, what awareness doesn't translate to like actual action, and that's kind of like where things the energy I think should be focused now, and translating that awareness and that willingness to reduce car use in the case of Our Streets Chorlton definitely requires other things that are possibly beyond the grasp of a normal household or a community, and that's why we were emphasizing there is whether it's policy support, political support, or just funding for those infrastructures to be available, that will definitely be necessary to make all these change happen. Because behavior change, for very loosely, if you want to make it happen, there's definitely some material aspect that's required to it, and for transport that's very important.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing other really interesting questions coming in. So we've got one here for Stuart. I was wondering, and thank you, Lois asked the question. I was wondering whether you thought car-free cities will ever be accepted by the public and how that might be achieved. I wondered, as I know that low traffic neighborhoods have faced a lot of backlash. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I guess it's not. If we're talking about sort of acceptance, it almost, and I'm not saying the question is implying this, but it almost implies something being imposed on people. You know, this is a thing we're going to do. Do you accept this? And I think what Jella's work speaks to is that actually when you have kind of that grassroots momentum, people on the ground having a chance to say what they actually want and what they would like to see and being part of that, then, you know, people don't generally want cars full of streets and all the kind of stuff that goes with that. So that would be my kind of answer to that. I guess there's always this sort of status quo inertia, isn't there? You know, if you were to say, how should we design this neighborhood from scratch, we probably wouldn't do it by you know, making the car so dominant, but because that's the situation we have now, then any kind of change, it's easy often to see the sort of inconvenience or the problems. So I think that's the difficult part, is moving from one state to another. And a very quick point on the low-hanging fruit for behavior change initiatives: don't expand airports. You don't have to do anything, just don't expand them, and that will help behavior change.
Thank you, Stuart. And I think, I don't know if I'm wrong in this, Lorraine, but low traffic neighbourhoods, the backlash has only come from a small proportion of residents. Is that right?
Others may know more on this. Lois is actually doing her PhD on this as well. But yeah, I think there is a vocal minority who tends to be very anti it. We have found that quite a large proportion of people do support it, albeit with some caveats. So, you know, if it's done in a fair way, or if it addresses concerns of, say, disabled groups, etc. But broadly speaking, there is reasonable support.
Thank you. Just checking the questions. So from Jeremy, I'm struck by the stats in Angela's presentation relating to ideas for what could be changed to encourage active travel, and they seem really simple. Why can't the authorities see the logic?
They are simple from a perspective of engaging people and from getting people involved in starting the conversations that need to happen. So that was really good from the project. The authorities, at least in Chorlton, the community, the initiative, they definitely got the MPs involved, and that was good. They can see the logic. It's just a matter of the time that's needed to build that relationship between the community and the local authorities, whether funding is available. Again, as I've mentioned, this is a funded project, and the funding came from the National Lottery. It has stopped. And we are still continuing with engaging with the community members, interviewing them, asking about whether or not they think it has been successful to actually reduce car use. And one of our preliminary findings is that maybe it's not, because when the funding has ended, you can't just rely on volunteer initiative and volunteer action. And that's when the local authorities need to step in. And I guess, and this is just based on the reflections from what we know from our project and from the recent interviews that we're doing, is that there's the bridge that needs connecting there. Again, expectations. So what does the council expect from grassroots initiatives like this? And what do the grassroots initiatives, the community need from the local authorities? Having that conversation needs to happen. Because say, for example, there are now new school streets programs that are being done in Manchester, in the area as well, in South Manchester. That's outside the lottery funded project, and it's more Transport for Greater Manchester City Council initiative. But the support that was available to the schools doing that when Our Streets Chorlton was in place is not the same now that the local authorities and Transport for Greater Manchester are managing the program. So the community felt that that lack of support, or maybe the support that's needed. So yeah, conversation on expectations, I think, would be very needed. And again, having that happen, it's not just we want this project this month, we want it next month. It's what we were learning from working with all these local authorities is it takes a long time, although it's probably the time, considering the urgency of climate change, that needs to be happening really, really fast.
Thank you so much. We're coming right to the end of our session today, and there are more questions, so we'll try to stay behind and answer those questions on the chat for those of you who haven't had your question answered. I just wanted to, if possible, go around all of the speakers and just ask you to share in one point, or what's the one point that you would like people to take away from this session today. So the one thing you want them to take action on, or the one thing you want them to think more about. Thanks. Stuart, do you want to go first, because you have to dash?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess well, I think this relates to all the talks, that actually there is the latent sort of desire and motivation and interest and will to do things differently, whether that's by community groups or individuals or councils or national thing. I don't think we necessarily, well, I don't think most people, and from the survey research too, think that the situation we have is brilliant. So it's, in a way, it's the thing to take away is that the place we want to get to is a place that most people want to be at, and so, you know, be mindful that yeah, there is a lot of support for moving towards better forms of transport and travel.
Thank you. Bertrand?
Yeah, I would say definitively that the predominance of private car use, particularly single occupancy journeys, cannot be overlooked, and this is why governments or local authorities need to be very ambitious in trying to reduce this car use going forward. It's very difficult, because it's a difficult conversation to have with car users.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Lorraine?
I think my takeaway would be engagement is critical. So we know that actually speaking to a community at the earlier stage where you're trying to scope out what the problem is and look for solutions, and maybe low traffic neighborhoods is one of those possible solutions, actually engaging with people, listening to their concerns and constructing a scheme that works for everybody, they will feel that's fair if they've been listened to and if their concerns are integrated into the scheme design. So I think that can allay some fears by actually engaging people at the earliest stage wherever possible.
Thank you. And Angela?
Yeah, just to echo that early engagement, and also if, I guess, like from a personal level, and we also say this when we talk to the wider public about how to reduce their own transport emissions. And as I've mentioned earlier, normal is different, but there are ways to reduce your own car use, such as car share, like all these sharing economy initiatives that are around, such as car sharing. These are one of the ways to reduce your own personal emissions. And if you live in a community that's like Chorlton that has high car use, or if you're in that similar experience, and we talked a lot about local authorities and engaging with them, definitely make them known that this is an important issue for you. Whether or not you write to your MPs or get in touch with your local community, because we know, at least from our work, that there is power in grassroots action. It's just that there are, again, bridges, connections that need to be done. But yeah, I guess like just if you have the time and privilege to reach out to those decision makers and make those connections happen. In addition to, I guess, like again, personal car use reduction. I guess that should be a takeaway, at least from what we learned from our project.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who came today, those of you who hung on a bit late as well. We really, really appreciate that. I've popped a link in the chat for anyone interested in CAST's latest work. So, for example, the work that we've presented today with the Scottish Government is there under cast.ac.uk. And then if you go to publications and then reports, but we've got lots of briefing papers on there, academic papers, case studies, lots of interesting stuff. And please do get in touch if you have any further questions or feedback. We really appreciate all of your thoughts and learning from you as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely day.